What percent of the police live in the city?
About 5% or so.
5%, so 95% don't live in the city.
Yes, sir.
So when you say that the vast majority of the percentage goes towards salaries, etc.,
Yes, sir.
fringe benefits, that means that they take their money on 81, go to outside the city, pay taxes in those communities that have some of the best schools while we have an underfunded school district.
$60 million up.
So I just want to put into context what we're talking about, because it's really easy to say, Mayor, and with all due respect, I like you, but that was a very politician answer.
What specifically?
We will consider and we will look. What we're saying is we're not interested in considering and looking. What we're saying is actually there's 50 million, commit to 20 million cut.
Right.
Because we're sending money as the mayor of Syracuse. When you don't have a tax base, you're sending money out of Syracuse, and not just for 30 years, for the rest of their life. Because their pensions, their health insurance, their families. So we are funding for other people's communities to have the promise of the American dream while we are denying it in our community. That's the context that you as the mayor have to look at this under. So when we talk about renegotiating union contract, what we're saying is you can't play around with maybe no, y'all gotta go because you don't provide a service that is beneficial to the community, that is meaningful to the community. The services that you provide criminalize our community, impoverish our community, reallocate resources to suburbs. We are actually funding the suburbs, both in our police departments and in our schools. And to be clear, it's not just the fact of like the percentage of people. We're also funding what race of people on the police force. The percentage of race of teachers as well, superintendent, board president. So we want to put in context because it's not just a class issue, it's a race issue.
Everybody saw you in that viral clip at City Hall. That's why I want to have you on. You spoke so well on this issue that we're talking about in America right now with police departments and what needs to happen following, the death of Ahmaud Arbery in particular. I think that's an interesting one. We'll get to that, of course, because that wasn't the police. That was, vigilante killing of sorts.
Yeah.
Breonna Taylor and others at the hands of law enforcement, obviously. But we're talking here on Dome Theory today with Yusuf Abdul-Qadir, adjunct professor at Syracuse University, American Civil Liberties Union in Syracuse, New York. I want to get in your background for the people that only know you from the clip. How long have you lived in Syracuse? What's been the life that you've lived to get to the point where, you're involved with the ACLU and speaking at City Hall and all these things?
Thank you very much for having me, Bobby. As you said, my name is Yusuf, and you said it right. So I give you a check plus for that.
Thank you. I got to check that. It's a podcast.
Hey, listen, you would be surprised. I had kind of as an aside, I had a interesting post that I shared the other day about names and how people like to call me everything but Yusuf. So thank you again for, saying my name right. And I really appreciate this conversation. I'm originally from the Bronx. And I went to middle school and high school in Spring Valley, New York, which is in Rockland County. And I came to Syracuse in 2004 as a freshman, and have been here. The entirety of the time that I've been here is 16 years. But I've left to go back to New York and come back, and then left to work at the UN and then came back. Actually, almost exactly a little over 5 years ago. I came to become the director for the Central New York chapter of the NY CLU, which is the ACLU of New York. And it is in that context that I am here deeply engaged in trying to center and build the power of communities who are directly impacted on virtually every civil liberties and civil rights issue, whether it's excessive uses of force and from law enforcement, the kind of characterization of justice in the criminal legal system, LGBTQ rights, environmental justice, and combating environmental racism. And it is in that context that we had an intervention in July of this year where we discussed the kind of ways with which the ecosystems, policies and practices that include law enforcement both maintain racial caste and white supremacy, but also extract resources out of Black and brown communities in devastating, tragic ways.
Now, Syracuse is, and I covered housing in Syracuse. I covered healthcare in Syracuse, a couple things that go into this conversation. And it is such an interesting epicenter of these social conversations we have because of just the environment there. Historically Black city, high minority, high refugee populations. We talk about the housing issues there, especially when it comes to lead paint, those kind of things. High crime, so a lot of police society interactions there, high police budget. And so we see you there in July lobbying the mayor, lobbying some of the leaders there, and this is a conversation that becomes more active in the wake of the killings that we've seen this year. But for you, did those speed up kind of the work that you do, motivate you more to get in there and have those conversations, or is that something you've been doing on a regular basis for a long time now in the city?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I want to say that we have a coalition called the People's Agenda for Policing. It's a multi kind of faceted organization that engages advocates and organizers and regular community people and people who are in policy to think critically about how do we transform issues around policing in Syracuse. We're not really dedicated to reform because, quite frankly, reform hasn't worked. You can't reform away some of these issues. We actually have to radically transform the relationship between law enforcement and the communities that they serve. And it's really key to understand that we have to abolish policing as we know it. The institution of policing emerged out of the maintenance of white supremacy, kind of continued through slave catching, and really as we see in the 21st century, after the kind of ways with which it maintained Jim Crow and segregation in the 50s, 60s, it's been the major facilitator for the mass incarceration epidemic that we see today. Mm-hmm. And so it's not new that we've been doing this work. I think what made this moment or that moment unique or important was we actually, as a coalition, do everything by consensus. And we were pretty explicit that after several years of having kind of open dialogue with the administration, after trying to cross every T and dot every I and follow every part of the process, that wasn't working. So we needed to stage an intervention that reasserted the power imbalance that exists between those who are public servants and those that they serve. And that we wanted to be clear that the way with which we are addressing these issues are not going to be adequate, that business as usual is over, and that we have to chart a new course and we have to rise to this moment. I would be remiss if I didn't mention a slain person in Rochester, New York, Daniel Rel Prude, who in March, just before the death of George Floyd, was actually killed by Rochester police officers, a person who has a history of mental health issues, and whose body camera video, or the body camera video of his death, was recently released from a group called Free the People in Rochester. And it's another example of the countless people whose names we just don't know, that don't get the kind of viral moments, that don't get a person on standby or an onlooker to record it and share it on social media. And it's another example of the ways with which the entire system, I mean, these officers have been on the force since then. After George Floyd, they've not been fired, they've not been prosecuted, they've not been held accountable. The mayor knew, the chief of police knew, the district attorney knew, and it's just deeply concerning. So I wanted to take a moment to honor him and his family, and really all those that we don't get to hear of, and those that we hear of, but whose voices kind of faint in the distance.
Certainly, in every city, we've heard the three notable ones in these cases, but there are names that go back decades and decades, especially before the time of smartphones as we have today, that weren't seen, that had the police's point of view taken as the gospel truth. I think that's something we on the journalism side are coming to grips with too, because you go to school for journalism and one of the tenets they teach you is to lean on the public officials, police included, for the information. And we look back now when there were releases versus what actually happened in these videos that you see afterward, that there's discrepancies there, and it's worth questioning those things as well. So two things I wanted to focus on. One we'll get to later, the sports side of this. This is Dome Theory, sports and culture. Sports and these social issues have gone hand in hand, at least when it comes to national coverage. And we talk about bringing these issues to the forefront. I think it does something well in that, but also says something about the society in that we lean on these entertainment figures, athletes, those kind of people to be the voices of this. So I want to have someone on like you who is doing the groundwork here, who has been trying to make these changes happen for, close to a decade now, actually be the voice to this and talk about some of the solutions and, things that need to change here. But, people who saw you in that viral clip at City Hall in Syracuse, talking to Mayor Walsh and bringing up one of a million different directions we could go in this. And one that hasn't been talked about a lot, maybe a little bit around New York City, but at least from stuff I've heard that I've read, this hasn't been talked about a lot. But you bring up as part of that long speech that you had there that the police in Syracuse, and I'd say in numerous large cities, Syracuse more of a medium city, but New York especially, don't live where they work. And there are various different issues with that. You hit on the money that goes to them and then leaves the city. You also just talk about familiarity between the people who you work for in the public and these police officers and the community. I mean, it's not their community at the end of the day that they're working in. So what prompted you to emphasize that among all the different things we could talk about when it comes to the police?
Yeah, no, it was, it's an important moment. I think because it puts into context what people mean when they talk about the way with which resources are extracted out of low-income communities in devastating, tragic ways, especially when those communities are Black and brown. It's not just that there is a warrior cop mentality with all the language, the technology, the mindset of war, right? Think about how we speak about it. The war on crime, the war on drugs, the war on terror. It's this mindset, the technology, the equipment that law enforcement use when they engage in these communities as if they're in a war zone, as if they're an occupying force and that these are occupying territories. And the types of tactics and strategies that they use are akin, if you will, to the ways with which the rules of engagement of war are. And that was one set that was important to raise. The second set that kind of has now gone viral and really sometimes appropriated properly, but oftentimes misappropriated, because we weren't necessarily speaking about or to the need for law enforcement to live in communities that they serve. Of course, that's an important thing to happen. And of course, the law enforcement reflecting demographics of the communities that they serve is also important, right? So we wanted to make clear that, 95% of the law enforcement in Syracuse don't actually live in the city of Syracuse. Similar statistics exist in Rochester and in Buffalo, in Utica, and other parts of the state and around the country. And not only that 95% of the law enforcement didn't live in the city, but that they were racially not representative of the demographics of the city of Syracuse either. So 92+% were white, with a city that has 50% minority population. And when you add the mentality, the language, and the types of implicit biases that kind of run amok, the idea that there's something about Black people, about brown people that make them uniquely suspicious, that warrants kind of excessive behavior because they can't be civilized, that they're going to be animalistic, that they're going to be needing to be brought to heel, so to speak. That is brought to bear. So that's the second set. And the third set, which I think is the most important, is as we consider the fact that Syracuse has the highest concentration of poverty amongst Blacks and Latinos in the country, as we consider the fact that Onondaga County, which is the county whereby city of Syracuse sits in, is the 9th most segregated county in the United States, as we consider the hyper-segregation in schools, where Onondaga County, again, has the most segregated school borders within the state of New York, and as we consider the fact that the way that we fund schools is through property taxes, and we do not have enough property taxes in Syracuse to be able to provide students with a sound, basic, not stellar, not dynamic, not excellent, not world-class, basic education as articulated by the New York State Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in the state. We are funneling resources on Interstate 81 in ways that facilitates for those monies that come out of taxpayer dollars to go on the highway and out of our community so that suburban communities, which are largely white, which are largely segregated, have all of the types of opportunities, all of the privileges, all of the resources, all of the services that we can't have in Syracuse. To be explicit, we had to use GoFundMe this summer to open up pools in Syracuse. But we had the money for armored vehicles, for tanks, for helicopters, 500 police officers across 5 or more police departments for a peaceful protest. We had to put the city on a curfew for really nothing that was quite serious. And to be even further, as the city has to deal with the cuts that need to be made to the budget because of COVID, we're seeing that there are no real cuts being done to law enforcement. But you better believe that parks and recreation and youth services, the types of services that we know combat youth violence, that we know combat crime in our communities, the types of services and organizations that provide the kind of mentorship, we're cutting those organizations and those services, but we're not cutting the size, scope, and power of law enforcement. It makes us question, why do we prioritize solutions that don't work, that haven't been adequate, and that we know have been centered around white supremacist, racial caste approaches, as opposed to the best practices that we know work. And I think it's in time for us to begin to ask that question and demand that we change and radically shift this relationship into a new direction.
Yeah.
That is what we were talking about.
And that scarcity mindset is what kills me about this conversation, because we in America do live with like the scarcity mindset at the government level, that you got to cut education, that you got to have balanced budgets at the local level, at the state level. So all
But
of
we
a
will
sudden,
increase the defense budget every year.
yeah, and that's nationally where you can run deficits and all that stuff. But again, we're not getting money kicked back to the states, back to communities when they're, facing losses bigger than ever during this COVID time. And the discussion right now is defunding the police, moving money from police departments, which by and large are the most heavily funded function of a city, even though I don't think anyone would necessarily say that the most important thing in a city is the police. But that's an aside. And try to get that funding toward education, toward housing, toward these inputs of crime. You're lacking in those areas. If you better fund those, you'd have lower crime in the first place. But there's sort of this mentality that you need to respond to crime, that you need to have a strong police force to be there in a city like Syracuse where crime is high, instead of trying to address those inputs of crime. Like it's backwards to me in a way.
It is. And I also want to be cautious, because I think what we tend to do in trying to make this argument is create a false narrative that there's something unique about poverty that makes people who are impoverished more criminalizing, right? More likely to engage in criminal acts. When in fact, that's actually not what the issue is. We both went to Syracuse University. I've gone to a fair frat party in my day, and I've seen excessive amount of drug use, every kind of drug at those parties. But I never saw law enforcement there. I never saw police there. I never saw DPS, which is Syracuse University's Department of Public Safety. I never really saw them there, but I did see them stopping Black frat parties. I did see them stopping Latino frat parties. I did see them frequenting South Campus, which is a large Black student population. So it's not that Black and brown people or poor people are more likely to be engaged in criminal activity. It's that we actually deploy services and resources to Black and brown communities, despite the fact that Black people and white people commit crime at basically the same rates. And so I want to just be careful about not giving the argument that, poverty breeds crime, because it's not necessarily the case. There's definitely a correlation between the two, but even when there is the same type of crime being done in a non-impoverished community, you still do not see law enforcement showing up to those areas. And I think that's really centered around the racial dynamics that exist and the views of who are criminal and who is dangerous. And I think that's really the key that needs to be taken away from this conversation.
Yep, the allocation. So protests, they've been going on. They continue to go on 3-4 months in. Early stages of it, you do start to see some commitments by cities to move budgets, to take solutions, to try to do things here. It's interesting, we hear at the political level, especially nationally, a more moderate, reform-minded message. Like I hear Joe Biden talking today about good cops, bad cops, and then, in the streets, it's almost the entirely other side of people going as far as to say, get rid of policing in America, rebuild something else in its place. And that's the gap we kind of have between, nationally, at least the moderate Democratic Party, and then, more of a left-leaning side of it there. What steps is Syracuse specifically? You have people in the streets every day, months after months now. What have they taken to respond to that, to respond to the lobbying your groups have done at this point? And what have you seen in other cities out of this that you think move in the right direction?
We have a series of 9 demands, and we don't call them recommendations or asks or inquiries. We call them demands because we're saying this needs to happen. One of them has already happened by publicizing the police union contract. That was really important so that people can begin to understand how is it that law enforcement can skirt away from being held accountable. And often that's what's within the union contract. And our belief is that when people can see the contract, when that gets kind of put to the light of day, what winds up happening is we're able to see, wait a second, why is it that, we allow for these types of behaviors? Why isn't sexual assault considered a fireable offense? That seems to be something that should be pretty obvious when an officer engages in misconduct, particularly sexual assault or rape, as has been the case in the city of Syracuse, that officer should be fired and prosecuted, except in the case of Syracuse, that officer will not only stay on the force, but could potentially get promoted. We talked about changing the use of force policy. And for those who don't know the use of force policy, it's basically a policy that determines the ways with which law enforcement are able to use different types of force, whether that's tasers, whether that's chokeholds, or other types of escalations, lethal force as well. And it's a kind of rules of engagement for law enforcement. And Syracuse's mayor wanted to present the idea that other communities around the country are doing these things that we've already done in Syracuse, and tried to paint himself and Syracuse as a national leader, but forgot to share the detail that the only reason why Syracuse addressed the issues around chokeholds is because we at the NYCLU had to sue them. And it wasn't an easy lawsuit. His corporation counsel fought so that a 15-year-old couldn't get justice. And I want to be clear that this was a 15-year-old. The day prior, he was 14. This was his 15th birthday. A young man who was stopping a fight was put in a chokehold by a police officer whose duty it is to protect and serve, but put him in a chokehold to the point that he fell to the ground, almost lost consciousness, had a gash from the right part of his cheek to the bottom left part of his cheek. And in that encounter, that young man didn't say, I want $1 million settlement. He didn't say, I want, the officer to be fired. He said, I don't want anyone to ever experience this again. And even in that, the city's lawyers, the Office of Corporation Counsel, fought for that change to happen. So Mayor Walsh wants to present the idea that he's this grand reformer, but doesn't give you the idea that actually you're not reforming because you decided to on your own. In fact, when we have pushed you, you still haven't done the things that you've committed to, which is what that 3-hour and 40-minute intervention was about. Because we sat for months, in fact, for 2 years, advising and trying to get the administration and trying to work with them to change. We provided them an 18-page document which analyzed their use of force policy, which compared it to other jurisdictions across the country, which took recommendations from the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And he didn't take those recommendations. And so I think it's important to put into context that we had a series of 9 demands, and while we haven't gotten all of them done, we're demanding that they be done. To date, we have 2 of them done, and it's in a few weeks, the 3rd demand, which is a piece of legislation around the Right to Know Act, would be implemented, which is a law that deals with citizen police encounters. And we're going to continue to make sure that the remaining 6 demands are met. And we're going to continue to amp pressure in every sort of way possible and continue to escalate to make sure that that happens.
You mentioned the legal side, and that's something the Civil Liberties Union is always going to be involved in there. And I find it interesting. We're having a discussion about police in this country. We're also having a discussion about mail in the country. And I listened to the fundamentals of this postal service conversation, and they have a union, but the only reason they can have a union is because they're a semi-independent government entity that has to prove its worth, that has to fund itself, that has to, generate the money to actually pay out to its employees and all that stuff. But when we talk about police, one of the most powerful unions in the country, you discuss the union contract, we think of some of the legal shoo-ins that they have, like qualified immunity, all these different things. FOIA, I think they're exempt from FOIA too in many cases. The amount of shoo-in they have is unbelievable. And compared to other unions, compared to other public institutions, they just have so much more legal power when it comes to the union, government contract, and interaction.
I think the context with which you put your question is really important, right? Because they do have a tremendous amount of power. And, we believe in collective bargaining. We believe in people's right to organize. We believe in unions. I mean, we are the American Civil Liberties Union. So we believe in those principles and those ideals. I think the challenge and the struggle that we find ourselves in is that the way with which law enforcement engages is so grossly problematic that they use their power to not allow the public's benefit to be fulfilled. And so, to give a specific example beyond union contracts, when an officer engages in misconduct, oftentimes, until recently, you would not be able to get access to their personnel records to show that his officer has not just one incident, but a history, a pattern, and a practice of engaging in excessive uses of force, as was the case with the officer who killed Eric Garner, Officer Pantaleo. That officer had a history of excessive force, and not just excessive force in the broadest of terms, a history of a relationship with this individual, Eric Garner. We find the same thing with Officer Gavin, who was the officer that killed George Floyd. Again, the same kind of excessive force history. We find that there are these repeated offenders, and in the city of Syracuse, we have an oversight body called the Citizens Review Board, which has quasi-independent authority to be able to engage in investigations, come up with a series of findings, and make recommendations for discipline. The police department has stymied any ability for real accountability to happen by not sharing what is the legislative requirement that they have on the ordinance that institutes the Citizens Review Board to share information with the CRB when they are doing an investigation, to the point that they waited in many instances beyond 18 months, which is the legal time frame for an officer to be disciplined. So even if the CRB sustains a finding, they can never hold the officer accountable because it's outside of the window. And so you see a series of practices and structures and systems that are established in such a way that absolve law enforcement from being able to be held accountable. And honestly, that's not fair. It's not fair that we as taxpayers, again, in the city of Syracuse, but as well as many other cities around the country, have to pay millions of dollars in lawsuits when officers engage in misconduct. But the officer has no accountability for that behavior if they're ever disciplined. And in the case of Syracuse, what we've actually seen happen is that when an officer engages in misconduct, and when that misconduct has resulted in the death of an individual, we've seen officers get awarded. And so it's a tragedy and a travesty. It's a mischaracterization of justice. And while we believe in the idea and the ideals of collective bargaining rights and unions, there is something specific and unique about the ways with which the police unions operate that set them apart from other unions that I think needs to be examined a bit further.
Absolutely. And you brought up something definitely important and early in the interview, that these interactions fall on minority populations in particular because of that allocation issue. But I think what anybody can at least empathize at the most minimal level in this is the idea of wanting to get the most out of your public institutions, and the idea of accountability, and this idea that everybody loves the Constitution. We have all these different Bill of Rights to protect against this overreach of government power that, most typically happens through the police. They're the government arm that's interacting with the people on a day-to-day basis. I think if you can't empathize on any level with this, you should at least be able to look at it through that angle and feel for it. But this is what we're seeing right now with the NBA, some of these sports leagues. The WNBA, I think, doesn't get enough credit in this. I mean, they have been extremely vocal going back for years before this. And I heard some of their players talking while the NBA players were protesting, and they're discussing, the highest paid player in the WNBA makes just under $200,000 a year. So they're saying, if we have to step away from this, if we have to lose our contracts for this protest, we might have to be ready to go do something else. And that's
actually, they many of them have, right?
Yeah, Maya Moore.
Exactly. And I think I'm happy that you started with the WNBA, because oftentimes Black women are ignored and are kind of not recognized. I mean, if you look at the ways with which, I don't want to do tragedy Olympics, but if you look at the ways with which there's been a significant amount of attention on the deaths of Black men, but very little justice, if justice at all, for Breonna Taylor. The fact that we've learned in the news that the district attorney is actually trying to get her ex-boyfriend to claim that she was engaged in criminal activity just to justify their extrajudicial killing of her. I mean, it's amazingly atrocious.
Can you get into a little bit? Can you get into that Breonna Taylor case a little bit? Because we're 171 days out, no arrests, no movement at all, and I think that confuses some people. Like, why is that?
It is disgusting, and this is why I do not call it the criminal justice system. Because if you think about her case, there's nothing just about this, and it's also why we talk about these issues as an ecosystem. Because what is often underreported is that the neighborhood that she lived in was a neighborhood that was becoming gentrified. And the more that it was becoming gentrified, the increasing presence that law enforcement was needed to keep the new incoming community members feeling safe. And it's so important because we see this pattern around the country. We see it in Syracuse, right? So Syracuse is going through a shift. Downtown Syracuse is going through a rebirth and has been going through a renaissance for the last 10 years or so, where apartments are like $3,000 a month, where the occupancy is like almost 100%. It's like 99%, where the median income is like $100,000. If you go a few blocks away, the median income is like $20,000. And what we're seeing is as there's an expansion in downtown Syracuse, as it becomes gentrified, the presence of surveillance cameras and the presence of police officers and the presence of police stations in those areas are increasing. And you saw the same thing in the case of Breonna Taylor. And so as law enforcement comes into her home as she is sleeping, a first responder, a woman who is aspiring to just be a successful human being, the kind of dreams that we all dream of, to the dreams of being a mother, perhaps, the dreams of being a successful, self-fulfilling, self-sustaining woman, the dreams of being loved and married, the dreams of being able to start a family of her own, the dreams of being a being, were snuffed away from her for sleeping in her bed through a no-knock warrant, where the officers barged in the home, shot up dozens of bullets that wound up shooting her boyfriend at the time, not knowing what's going on because no one announced that they were there. No one announced they had a warrant. No one announced that they were law enforcement, and was getting fire and was firing back on them, was arrested. Breonna winds up dead. Innocent, killed, no justice for her whatsoever. And not even her memory is being honored in the way that it should be. Not a recognition of the fact that this life is gone. And it's completely untenable. And so it's not the first instance of a black woman whose life has been snuffed away. You know, you can be black and sleeping. You can be black and walking. You can be black and jogging. You could be black and driving. You could be black and in a suit. You could be black and a professional. You could be black and homeless. The greatest indicator is the fact that you are black. And that's what ties all these cases together. And so it's with a heavy heart that we see there has been no justice for Breonna Taylor. The news cycle has shifted to other issues. The trends have kind of let her story get, you know, kind of further and further wiped out into the annals of Twitterverse. And we see, but not for the fact of the WNBA and others who continue to uplift her name and to say her name and recognize her, that we would have lost attention. So I think it's important to uplift the WNBA and women of the WNBA for making sure that we don't lose her story.
Yeah, and I wonder what the impact of that NBA protest, the WNBA, pushing the conversation around that. I find it so interesting. I'm in the sports world, so I cover these things, and it seems like so much of society looks to the entertainers, to the athletes, to these people at high levels of attention to talk about these things, to do something about these things. And I found it interesting in the protests on the NBA side, Fred VanVleet saying that these organizations, which are multi-billion-dollar organizations, could use their pull in the communities, could use their money in the communities they're in, especially in Wisconsin when we talk about Jacob Blake, to pressure change here. But the protest ends after a week. Didn't get any direct commitments of that kind, at least that were out there publicly. And sort of go back to this. So there's an awareness to this that I think is positive, but do we put too much on athletes, on entertainers, on, you know, celebrities in general on these things, especially you as someone who, you know, is doing the work on the ground? Or is it just useful to have that message out there anyway?
I think it's tremendously important that their activism occurred in the moment that it did.
Mm-hmm.
And not everyone can be marching in the streets every day. Not everyone can be deeply involved in policy analysis. Not everyone can be litigators and suing in court. Not everyone can be giving a speech or having a discussion on a podcast. People can do what they can do in their faculties, in their capacities, and with the power that they have. And with the power that they have, they did bring attention to this issue. Perhaps there could have been more change that could have happened. Perhaps there's more that needed to go on. But they did something important and historic. And I don't want to undervalue what that is, and what's to say that their work is done.
Yep.
You know, the shift in conversation has occurred. And it wasn't just WNBA and NBA. It was Major League Soccer. It was Major League Baseball. It was the most historic sports event in the sense of social justice consciousness. Tremendous power. And I think what they were doing in taking a strike is saying, if you don't begin to shift things, you're going to see that we're going to walk away. And now the ball is in the court, so to speak, of the owners. What are the owners going to do? Because it's their obligation as well. It's not just on the black bodies to elevate these issues. What are white people going to do in positions of power? What are others in positions of power and authority going to do to speak out about injustice? You know, to say that this is not okay and to do something about it. And so I want to acknowledge that there was a tremendous import and value add. You know, it did continue to give energy to the issue and help to continue to sustain the momentum at a point that was really essential and necessary. And I don't want to undervalue that. I think it's really tremendous and important. There's obviously more work that can be done.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that they do continue. And if they want to talk, we can figure out some things together. But I really do think that it was an important contribution to history and to this moment that we find ourselves in today.
For certain. Yusuf Abdul-Qadir, doing the work on the ground, dropping the knowledge here. If people want to help out the things you do, the things people are doing on a day-to-day basis to improve these things, to make the adjustments that are needed, to win these battles, what can everyday people do?
There's a few places I would recommend people go to. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the NYCLU. So please go to nyclu.org and support our work. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Black Freedom Project, which is doing so much work around these issues, and excuse me, Black Freedom Movement rather, that is doing so much work around these issues, and really is engaged around around addressing the challenges that we're seeing in our communities. If you're considering about Syracuse, there's the Syracuse chapter of the National Action Network that is doing tremendous work. And the group who is in Syracuse working on the issues around police reform is SPARC, Syracuse Police Accountability and Reform Coalition. And our website is SPARC, SPAARC 315.org. Folks, please go to your local officials, to your state officials, to your federal officials, and demand change. They work for us. They are public servants. And if, as we say in the organizing world, what do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now. If we don't get it, shut it down. And I think it's incumbent upon us to realize that they really should be working on behalf of our interests and our concerns. And if we don't get it, we've got to shut it down.
Thanks, Yusuf. And if you want to keep following him, you can find him on Twitter at Yusuf, YUSUFAQ. Thanks for being here on Dome Theory, man. Always good. This podcast originated in Syracuse, so to connect with people in Syracuse, there's nothing better. We'll talk to you soon, man.
Take care.